self-determination and self-determination. I flipped through that book many times a day in my little room in Oxford, kind of checking my reality.
What year did you get?
So it's really, it was a special book for me during my studies, and it influenced me. So it's a great honor to have you here, and it's especially great that Professor Richard Stone is supporting ISGAP's efforts here in Columbia. I invite you to introduce Rabbi Telushkin.
Thank you, Charles. It's flattering to be called a student while I was in Russia in 1973, the Soviet Union, but that's not true. I was actually taking a gap year between serving as Assistant Solicitor General of the United States and beginning as an associate professor at this institution, and I was really no longer a student except a student of life. And Rabbi Telushkin, with me, was already an ordained rabbi. So we were not kids, although I will confess to you, we were given the assignment we had, we were green and we were frightened. We weren't in Moscow and Leningrad, we were in Moscow, but the core of our assignment was not to go to well-populated, well-known places. We were the first people to visit Siberia. We entered the Sino-Soviet border in Khabarovsk and went to Irkutsk and Novosibirsk, and the Yom Kippur War broke out while we were there, and we didn't get news of that war for the first 4 days. We were among the only well-informed Jews in the world who didn't realize that that war was taking place. That is part of, and I suppose in some way defines, as opening remarks, my 40-some-odd year close friendship with Rabbi Joseph Telushkin. We have known each other a long time, have been through a great deal together, and that trip to Russia is the thing we most reminisce about, but there are many other topics. His resume is so well known to so many of you. I will say simply that I woke up this morning on an airplane having taken the red eye from California, and only Rabbi Telushkin, Charles, not you I'm afraid, would have attracted me to come here today to attend this event. Rabbi Telushkin is, as we said, an ordained rabbi at Yeshiva University, who is now essentially the most prolific and I think the best popularizing writer, and I mean that in a very, very high sense, not in any demeaning sense, of Jewish information and Jewish education of anyone in the country. He has really perfected the vehicle of writing something that an intelligent person with less than a full Jewish background can learn deeply from, at the same time to give a review to people who have a better Jewish education. And he's done it many, many times, starting with the book 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, which was called by Herman Wouk the Intelligent Skeptic's Guide to Judaism. He wrote in those days together with his lifelong best friend Dennis Prager. The two of them brought a very interesting perspective together. They published a few books early. It was the book about anti-Semitism and reasons for it together.
Yes.
And then Joseph Bolton, and went on his own and has published a lot of great books: Jewish literacy, Jewish humor, the Bible, etc., etc. And he has not yet published, but has just given a select few of us, the galleys, to what could be the book that not only puts him on the map, he's long been on the map, but gives him a place on the map and puts him in the middle of controversy, conversation of people deeply interested in Jewish subjects, and that is a very sophisticated biography of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And so, you can't have that yet. It's still in galleys. Only a few of us get to read that now. But come June 10th, you'll not only see it, but you'll see him in probably every Barnes and Noble between here and Lexington Avenue. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin will speak to this group. Joseph, I think if Judge Ginsburg were not downstairs with 700 or 800 people in attendance, it would be a bigger crowd, but this is a high-quality crowd, And given a choice, I would definitely come to see you.
Thank you.
touched. I did not realize Richard came here from the Red Eye. So I feel under even greater obligation to say something intelligent. What I want to do, as a rule, am I being videotaped?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I have to stay here. Okay.
You don't have to.
As a rule, anti-Semitism has been such a recurrent problem in Jewish life that most of the talking about it deals with specific episodes and incidents that are happening. I want to step back and try and offer a thesis as to why the whole phenomenon exists. But first of all, just to establish the significance, very briefly, of the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, I would argue that there has been no hatred that has been as universal, as deep, or as prolonged as that of anti-Semitism. The universality of it is attested to by things we're all familiar with. Everybody here is familiar with the fact of the Jewish expulsion from Spain. But there were a lot of other such expulsions. Just 5 years after that, the Jews were expelled from Portugal. Along the way, Jews had been expelled from England, France, and Germany. In fact, one of the leading authorities on the Jewish expulsion from England in 1290 is sitting here, Richard Stone, who wrote this definitive work on it when he was at Harvard. By the way, did anybody happen to know, Richard can't answer because obviously he'll know the answer. Did anybody know when the Jewish expulsion from England happened?
1200.
Yeah, 1290. Which means that when Shakespeare wrote The Merchant of Venice, with its depiction of Jews as usurers who collect their interest in blood, there had been no Jew living in England for 300 years. It just shows how the horrible image of the Jews could continue to perpetuate anti-Semitism even when Jews weren't present. Jews, we know, in Russia were long restricted to where they could live, the Pale of Settlement. In the Arab world, since 1948, much of the Arab world, Jews were expelled or made so uncomfortable that virtually the whole Jewish communities left. The depth of anti-Semitism is attested to the fact that this hatred has bequeathed a number of words to the English language that other groups often use when they want to show how much they have suffered. Well, the more obvious one is, of course, the word ghetto. But think about these other words, which are all outgrowths of anti-Semitism: pogrom, Holocaust, and genocide. In more recent years, another phenomenon has entered the Western world, and now it's not necessarily primarily associated with Jews, but it was started by anti-Semitism, and that, of course, is suicide bomber, which described the terrorist attacks perpetrated in Israel in the early 2000s, and which again underscores another important theme of anti-Semitism. Why should moral non-Jews be interested in it, other than the fact that any sort of prejudice like that is terrible? Because they're going to be the next targets of it. It starts with the Jews, but it never ends with the Jews. The day Khomeini was installed in Iran, not too many people will recall this, obviously by that point Israel was out of Iran, but you know who was standing there at Iran, at the Israeli embassy in Iran, waving? It was Yasser Arafat. Because what started again against the Jews, very short time later, culminate then the takeover of the American embassy in Israel. Right. The permanence of anti-Semitism is suggested by the fact that as small a group as the Jews are, they are often perceived as the great enemies, or among the greatest enemies of the leading world powers. The Romans had an enormous anger at the Jews, certainly for most of its history, and it's very important to stress that that is not the case today, but for most of its history, Christianity had a real animus against the Jews. And in the 20th century, the great powers, who did they go after? The Jews. It was the Nazis, the communists, and in the radical world of Islam, certainly today. So what is the reason for this great hatred? Now, if you look at modern attempts to explain anti-Semitism, generally they're written during a period when the Jews seemed less distinctive. Many Jews were no longer religious. And many of the people writing on anti-Semitism basically had only a secular framework out of which they would operate. So I'll give you a few examples. I would venture to guess that everybody here has at some point heard the theory offered that Jews were hated in medieval Europe because they were moneylenders. Now, it's an interesting question. Number one, do people have reason to hate moneylenders? Will surprise no one to learn that the answer is yes. In 13th century France, the average rate of interest on loans was 43% per annum. I don't think anybody had fond feelings towards the person who lent them money. But in order to assume that that was, for example, a cause of anti-Semitism, we'd have to make the following remarkable presumption. Jews were active, integrated members of European society. At some point in the 13th century, whatever was the equivalent then of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropies, got together, and the Jews made a decision, the real money to be made is in money lending, let's become money lenders. Of course, that's absurd. What happened was Jews were hated. Because they were hated, they were restricted in the professions they could practice. One of the professions they could practice was money lending. Once they became money lenders, it exacerbated, but it didn't cause anti-Semitism. Most of the factors that secular efforts to explain anti-Semitism fall prey to is they take factors that exacerbated anti-Semitism and they say those were the causative factors. But that wasn't the case. Economic issues are not real causes of anti-Semitism. In fact, Jews today in the United States are encountering a relatively low level of anti-Semitism. How many people here are your backgrounds ultimately Eastern Europe, your familial backgrounds? Okay? How many are German Jews? Sephardic Jews? Okay, I've never had it, quite to this extent. German and Russian Jews always had tensions. There's a famous incident at the Zionist Congress where Chaim Weizmann got into a fight with the German Jewish Zionist leaders. And he says, what the problem is with German Jews? They have all the charm of Germans and all the modesty of Jews. But in any case, I think it's probably fair to say that for almost all of us, our great-grandparents were significantly poorer than us and suffered significantly greater anti-Semitism. So Jews have tended very often have suffered less anti-Semitism in capitalist societies, and that wasn't the case in others. What about the theory of Jews as scapegoats? Also, we've often heard Jews are scapegoats. Hitler blamed the Jews to gain power. Lucy Dewitz, 40 years ago, wisely entitled The History of the Holocaust, The War Against the Jews, to underscore that as much as Hitler was fighting a war against the West, he was fighting a war to murder all the Jews in the world. Ava Reichman wrote one of the first early histories of Hitler's rise to power. She was a political scientist and wrote a book called Hostages of Civilization. And she made the point that within Germany, Hitler did in fact come to power largely on economic issues. Everybody in Germany knew Hitler hated the Jews. But he actually, during his campaigns in those years, disguised the extent of his anti-Semitism because he knew it had the capacity to alienate middle-class voters. Hitler, in other words, didn't blame the Jews to get to power, but as Davidowitz's thesis largely is, he gained power in large measure so that he could murder the Jews. Jews were not scapegoats. Anybody looks at Hitler's last message that he left when he committed suicide was he begged the people to continue a merciless war against the Jews, a statement that would make no sense if Jews were scapegoats to Hitler. But there's an even more fundamental problem with the scapegoat theory. It doesn't explain why the Jews. Why can different elements of a society be united, rich, poor, far right, far left, deeply religious and deeply anti-religious, when Jews are blamed? About 70 years ago, a Jewish writer at the time, Maurice Samuel, wrote a book about anti-Semitism called The Great Hatred. And he pinpointed the weakness of the scapegoat theory. He said, to say that a man has hallucinations when he's hungry makes sense. To say that a man has hallucinations only about Jews when he's hungry doesn't make sense. So the scapegoat theory still doesn't account for, in addition to being inaccurate, doesn't account for why such disparate elements can be united when it's against the Jews. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, the American Jewish Committee commissioned a series of studies trying to pinpoint the psychological explanation for anti-Semitism. The lead volume in the study was called The Authoritarian Personality, which tried to show that there was a psychological abnormality in the Europeans who supported Hitler and who supported anti-Semitism, that they were people who, because of certain weaknesses in their personality structure, were attracted to authoritarian regimes and anti-Semitic regimes. The problem is, what does that mean? That all the Europeans and all the Germans who supported Hitler were mentally sick, and after the war, when there was a change in Germany, people became suddenly mentally healthy. Jews would like to believe the psychological explanation because I think we all want to believe that if people were only psychologically healthy and pleasant people, they would all like us. But how do we account for the phenomenon that there are people who don't have other overt psychologically sick characteristics who hate us? Also, I'm not willing to say that everybody who saved Jews had to have been a model of mental health. Who knows? They could have been people who had martyr complexes or other things. I think it's too easy and too, in a sense, self-gratifying to blame it all on psychological disorders. The answer Dennis and I offered years ago in Why Do Jews, and which essentially I've held to ever since, is that ultimately anti-Semitism is a response to Jews, Judaism, and to Jewish values. My argument is that Judaism historically has stood on three pillars. The notion of God. It was the Jews who brought the idea of a single God into the world with a universal moral law. It was, by the way, that's what Jews claim that they were chosen for. Well, from that sense, chosenness is historically an accurate perception. If we're claiming that we were chosen to make God known to the world, that's how the world did learn about God. The Jewish concept of law, ultimately rooted in the Torah, in the Talmud, in Jewish laws, and the Jewish concept of peoplehood, which is one of the unusual features of Judaism, is that we are simultaneously a religion and a people. I'm going to say more about that in a few moments. Until around 1800, or even a little past, the world in which the Jews lived was primarily a religious world. And anti-Semitism was primarily directed against the religious components of Judaism. A Jew who is willing to give up his notions of God and law, and for example, to embrace Christianity, to embrace Islam, could be accepted. As the world shifted and became more secular, and peoplehood, nationalism became a more dominant value, anti-Semitism starts to shift more to being directed not against Jewish religion as much, but against the peoplehood aspect of Judaism. And that is why the most powerful contemporary expression of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. In those regions of the world where religion is still dominant, as in Islam, anti-Semitism focuses both on the Jewish religion and on peoplehood. Let me just review for a few moments what I mean by these three pillars of Judaism. Take the idea of God. Around the year 40, the Roman Emperor Caligula decreed that his statue should be erected at every temple in the Roman Empire. And so it was done, except for the temple in Jerusalem. The Jews refused to put it up. Caligula was furious, and he actually decreed that the temple should be destroyed. A delegation of Jews came to plead with him and said, "We are willing to make prayers at our temple on the emperor's behalf." Caligula, for all that he was known to be half crazy, was not stupid. He said, "I don't want you to make prayers for me, I want you to make prayers to me." To the Jews' great good fortune, he was killed in a palace intrigue a very short time after he had issued the order to destroy the temple, and it was delayed. It had a bit of an unhappy effect. The Jews were so convinced that that proved God was on their side that plans ultimately were made to continue to revolt against the Romans, which happened 30 years later, and that was a revolt that had very unhappy consequences for the Jewish people. Around the same time, Christianity comes into being. And for most of history, Christianity was the major factor in spreading hostility towards the Jews. Again, I emphasize that is not the case today, and today, in fact, particularly in the United States, Jews have unusually good relations with the Christian world. But what was the source of Christianity's animus towards the Jews? The issue, of course, had to do with the fact that Jesus was a Jew, all his early followers were Jews, and the Jews, the only people who knew him, rejected him. Let me draw an analogy, a far-fetched analogy. By the way, there are certain English words which, if you didn't know they were English, you'd assume were Yiddish, like the word far-fetched. Far-flung. Anyway, suppose, and again, I'm emphasizing it's far-fetched, suppose everybody in the United States believed Jimmy Carter was the Messiah. The only people who did not believe Jimmy Carter was the Messiah were a group of citizens in a little town in Georgia called Plains. How would the rest of us react to Plains, Georgia? In one of two ways. Either we would say, listen, if we who know him only a little think he's the Messiah, but they who know him well say he's not, they're probably right. Or alternatively, If we who know him only a little can recognize that he's the Messiah, that he's God, then they who know him well must surely know him. And if they refuse to acknowledge it, it must be because there is some evil within them. Unfortunately for the Jews, this latter was what was perceived. Christians actually thought the Jews knew Jesus was the Messiah, knew Jesus was God, but because of a perversity in their nature, refused to acknowledge it. That accounts for an aspect of medieval anti-Semitism that I'm sure has puzzled all of us. The nature of the crazy things people said about Jews. Okay, they say we hate Jews, Jews cheat people, Jews are snobs, whatever they could say, we could imagine people saying that. But Jews kill non-Jews and drink their blood? And that was widely believed? In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council of the Catholic Church affirms its official doctrine, the doctrine of transubstantiation, which means that at the Catholic Mass, how many people here have ever been to a Catholic Mass? How many of you have been in shul recently? Now, at the Catholic Mass, the wafer, we tend to think of it, the wafer represents the body of Jesus, the wine represents the blood, but Catholics don't think that. That the doctrine of Catholicism is that actually there's a miracle, transubstantiation. It becomes the body of Christ. It becomes the blood. Once that, so you'd think, okay, what does that have to do with the Jews? Unfortunately, the moment that doctrine was passed, thousands of Jews ultimately died because of it. Because if you actually believed that, it made sense that the Jews who had once crucified Jesus would break into Catholic churches, steal wafers, and actually torture them. I mean, it sounds so crazy, but that's what happened. Once you had that belief spread that the Jews knew who Jesus was but rejected it. In 1610, the medical faculty at the University of Vienna certifies its official opinion that Jewish law required Jewish doctors to kill 1 out of 10 of their Christian patients. Can you imagine what it was like to be in a Jewish doctor's office with 9 people in front of you? Martin Luther said Jews are so proficient in the use of poisons they can kill someone in 5 minutes or in 5 years. And here we come across one of the interesting aspects of anti-Semitism as well. Very often when people dislike another group, they will claim that the group that they dislike are also their mental inferiors. You meet white racists and you know the sort of things they're going to start saying about black people. It's an odd feature of anti-Semitism that anti-Semites have often said that Jews are very bright, but they think that they use their intelligence in a malevolent manner. In fact, I've concluded that there are 2 groups of people who think Jews are brighter than everybody else, anti-Semites and Jews. I wrote a book once on Jewish humor. One of the classic Jewish jokes is in the early 20th century, a Jew's traveling on the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and suddenly an officer in the Tsar's army gets on the train, sits down opposite the Jew. The train starts to move. Soon the officer grabs the Jew by the lapels and says, "Tell me, why are you Jews brighter than everybody else?" The Jewish guy doesn't know what to answer. Finally, he says, "I think it's because of the herring we eat." The train ride resumes. The Jew takes out a piece of herring and starts to eat it. The officer says, "How many more pieces of herring do you have?" "A dozen." "How much do you want for them?" 20 rubles, big sum of money. The Jew gives him the herring. The officer takes it back and says, "This is absurd. In Moscow, I could have bought all this herring for a few kopecks." The Jew says, "You see, it's working already." When it came to Islam, the source of the anti-Semitism in some ways was related to Christianity. Christians expected Jews to respond positively to the message of Jesus, just as Muhammad did. Muhammad thought that the Jews would acknowledge him as their prophet, and originally he displayed a friendly disposition towards Jews. But Jews didn't acknowledge Muhammad as a prophet, and this started to trigger tremendous anger. He got into political conflicts with Jews. He then made claims, whether he made the claims or claims were made in his name, in the Quran. If you look through the Quran, you can look up various verses. If anybody wants later, I can give you references. You'll find that the Jews took out from their Bible, Muhammad claims, a prophecy that Abraham had made about the future coming of Muhammad. He argued that Muhammad alone, was a true monotheist. Christianity was not true monotheism because they believed Jesus was God. I can understand that argument. But who does he claim Jews believed was God? Does anybody even know? Ezra, the prophet Ezra. He claims the Jews worshipped him as God. And then, because of the political conflicts he was having with the Jews, statements that he made in a context at that time were brought down in the Quran and understood as applying to Jews throughout history. Humiliation and wretchedness should be stamped upon them. A comment that Anwar Sadat, prior to his signing a peace agreement with Israel, and he does seem then at that point to have undergone a real transformation, but prior to that he used to speak to Egyptian officers about humiliation and wretchedness, as our prophet said, should be stamped upon them, and how Islam and how Israel was going to be defeated, and this would again be the condition of the Jews. The God issue has mattered to modern totalitarian movements as well. Hermann Rauschning, who was an early associate of Hitler and a friend of Hitler's, broke with Hitler, fled Germany, came to the United States, and published a book of what he called Hitler's Table Talk. He used to be present when Hitler would have afternoon meetings, and needless to say, nobody started arguing with Hitler at those meetings, but he would take notes. And a recurrent theme in Hitler's rants was he wanted to destroy the Asiatic god tyrant of the Jews and his life-denying Ten Commandments. He saw the whole notion of conscience as a Jewish invention by which weak people were enabled to weaken strong people from acting on their impulses. And of course, in the case of communism, the hatred of God, which was the Jewish contribution to the world, and the hatred of religion. What was it ultimately rooted in? It was ultimately rooted in the fact that in totalitarian movements, the last thing in the world the movement wants is anything above the movement. Because by definition, the movement defines morality. To take probably the most evil regime in the world today, and there's competition for that, but I think there's one that really ranks shoulders and head above, and that's North Korea, which seems to me to be as much like a Nazi state as anyone could imagine. You know, I remember reading recently of a case where there had been a bad storm, and it had shaken the trees. It was so pathetic, it's a heartbreaking thing. And so as a result, a Christian man there who had hidden a New Testament in his tree, it was shaken out of the tree, the neighbor found it, and the man and his family were all sent to concentration camps, which is the only way you really can refer to what goes on in North Korea. Because you can imagine in any totalitarian regime, the notion of belief in God is repugnant because it means there's something higher than the regime. When Richard and I were in Russia, dancing with Jews on Simchas Torah on our Kippur Street, one of the songs they sang said, "I fear no one, only God above." And at that moment, you understood why religion is such a threat to totalitarian regime. And just to give a break for just a second, two of the mitzvot in the Torah concerning God are love of God, which I think most people, if you have a belief in God, you're comfortable with that notion. And even if you don't have a belief in God, it's not a challenging notion. And it's a very well-known notion because it's in the first paragraph of the Shema. Yahavta, and you shall love the Lord your God. Most people, even religious people, are often uncomfortable with the notion of fear of God. But in the Bible, fear of God serves two functions. Number one, it liberates people from fear of human beings. The Bible goes out of its way to tell us that the two midwives who saved Jewish babies when Pharaoh was drowning them in the Nile, everybody know what their names were? Shifra and Puah, right. Shifra was lucky, girls were named after her. Not so many girls are named after Puah, but in any case. But anyway, when Pharaoh, the Bible explains why they did it. It says they feared God. In other words, everybody else in Egypt was going along with Pharaoh's orders because they were scared what would happen to them if they didn't. What liberated them was, they were probably also afraid, but they feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. So the Jewish notion of God is a tremendous threat to totalitarian regimes. What about law? In the medieval world, Jews wouldn't eat with their neighbors, they wouldn't marry with their neighbors. I don't think that ultimately was the cause of the real distrust. I think what happened was Jewish law affected Jews in ways that raised the quality of Jewish life and often made Jews the subjects of a great amount of envy. I'll just offer one example because we have a limited amount of time. You know, one common attribute of Jews that is well noted in the Western world has been Jewish professional success, Jewish professional affluence, which is often rooted in the fact of Jews having higher levels of education than the average non-Jews. You know, now a lot of attention is focused on the fact that the group people are most struck by having those attributes now are Asians who have come to the United States. But this was a fact. You know, Jews have long been represented in places where they were not subjected to quotas, well in excess of their percentage of the population. The Jewish representation at Ivy League schools is 10 times or more in excess of what it should logically be just based on Jews as a percentage of the population. I once computed that if statistics, worked on a random basis, one Jew should win one Nobel Prize every 30 years. In any given year, if a Jew doesn't win a Nobel Prize, how many of you assume that there was anti-Semitism? By the way, how many of you check each year to see if there were any Jewish winners? How many of you follow? Okay, it's right. It's so in excess. But what is the source of it? So again, when secular views were being offered, you get sociological explanations of the Jewish disproportionate success in education, and they'd say things like, Jews were discriminated against because a Jew knew that they were discriminated against, so Jews would work twice as hard and be twice as good in order to succeed, and that accounts for Jewish success. In one form or another, most of us heard explanations like that. The problem is those explanations are idiotic. They make no sense. The whole logic of affirmative action is that when groups are discriminated against, they do worse, not better. What are we going to say? When groups are discriminated against, they do worse, except for Jews. When they're discriminated against, they do better. It makes no sense. It's rooted in the fact that Judaism had a culture with an extraordinary emphasis on education. I don't know of other cultures, religious cultures, in which study becomes, v'shinantam levanecha, you shall teach your children, in which study becomes such an important component of it. The YIVO Institute in New York, subsequent to World War II, recovered many books, holy books, Sfarim, from Europe. And Abraham Joshua Heschel was once down there and came across one of them. It was a volume of the Mishnah, not in great shape, but it said on the front page of it, belongs to the daily Mishnah study group of the woodchoppers of Berdichev. That the woodchoppers of Berdichev used to get together every day between Mincha and Ma'ariv to study Mishnah ultimately explains why their great-grandsons and great-granddaughters in America pursue education with such avidity. There was a religious passion to education. If you look in the Orthodox world, if you look in the modern Orthodox world, so there's a passion both for religious and secular education. If you look in the Haredi Orthodox world, so the passion is generally extended just towards Limudei Kodesh, holy study. If you look in the non-Orthodox world, we're the bearers of this tradition in which study became something very holy. Now, as a result, the Jews really did end up achieving much greater financial success and other things, and it did inspire, in fact, a certain degree of envy. But again, it's also rooted in Jewish law. As regards peoplehood, the paradox of Jewish peoplehood is distinguished Jews from the earliest of times. When Ruth becomes a Jew, the first person that the Bible writes of at some length, assuming a Jewish character, she says 4 words in Hebrew that have ever since defined the essence of what it means to be a Jew. She says, Amech ami, Elohayech Elohai. Your people shall be my people, your God shall be my God. The two are inextricably linked. And this is, I would argue, also been the glory of Judaism. In the 1970s, I once had occasion to do an interview with William Buckley. And Buckley said, I only hope that if you Jews succeed in getting the Jews out of Russia, you'll leave at least a few Jews behind, so that at least the Jews in America will go on protesting the religious persecutions in the Soviet Union. Buckley said that because he was profoundly ashamed that Christians in America were not leading a fight against religious oppression in the Soviet Union. We know that Jimmy Carter, when he was president, raised the issue of the mistreatment of Jews in Russia. There was an enormous political pressure to do so. I don't know whether he raised the issue of the mistreatment of Baptists in Russia. Maybe he did. It hasn't yet come out. But there were hundreds of Baptists in Soviet prison camps for the crime of underground printings of the New Testament. But in the Jews, this linkage of religion and people had meant that we could never become such an abstract people that we weren't worrying about our people elsewhere. I remember that glorious day in 1984 when Israel in one day brought out 14,000 Jews from Ethiopia. And William Safire wrote a column. He said, I don't know if it's happened before in history that 14,000 black people were ever brought into a white nation to liberate them and not to bring them there to be servants. You know, there was always the discussion, were the Ethiopian Jews, were they not? Should they be accepted? Do they have to convert? I was in the camp of those who always believed they were Jewish, and I'll tell you why. When they came out, the Ethiopian Jews only knew two languages, Amharic and Gez. They had 7 words in Hebrew that they had kept for thousands of years. One of those words was goy. I was convinced that showed it. On the other hand, there was a flip side to the Jews being a religion of peoplehood, and the flip side was, could we be fully trusted to be loyal to the nations in which we lived? By the way, that concern about the dual loyalty charge was so profound that it animated Reform Judaism to originally drop the notion of peoplehood. Most people, when they think of early Reform Judaism, much of which was quite radical in what it was dropping from Jewish life, tend to think of it primarily in terms of its religious reforms. But the truth is, very central to early Reform Judaism, and again, this is not true of Reform Judaism today, but very central to early Reform Judaism was dropping the notion of Jewish peoplehood, which they thought really would call into question Jewish loyalties. In any case, the phenomenon today of anti-Zionism is directed against Jewish peoplehood. There'd be no shortage of anti-Zionists who would claim they don't care what religion the Jews practice, as long as they can, but they want to express their hatred to Israel, and that's where it really that's what it really comes down to. You look at the situation and the hatred of Israel, and I happen to be one who believes I wanted to be a Palestinian state. One of the reasons I wanted to be a Palestinian state is because ultimately I think otherwise the percentage of people living under Israeli rule who will be non-Jews will come to equal or exceed eventually. I think I desperately want Israel to be both a Jewish state and a democracy, and that is why I want to see it be primarily, overwhelmingly, a Jewish state. But the truth of the matter is, we shouldn't delude ourselves, obviously, though this group doesn't sound like a group that would delude itself about anti-Semitism. We shouldn't allow it. In other words, Israel haters wanted Israel dead before it had the West Bank. And they wanted Israel dead because they want to get rid of this one Jewish outpost of democratic, humanistic, and fundamentally Jewish values in the middle of the Arab world. So what can Jews do about anti-Semitism? I want to just offer a few things, and then I'd like to open it up for comments. The following strike me as possible solutions. One is, if you really want to rid yourself of anti-Semitism, is assimilate. And again, I don't think this group is convened to do that. But many Jews have tried to evade the consequences of anti-Semitism through assimilation. It's like a joke they tell, from the 30s, a Jew wants to get into a country club and he can't get in because he's Jewish. So finally he converts and applies for membership, and they ask him, what's your name? And he gives one of those pompous names like Hutchinson Ridger Parkway III. What do you do for a living? I own a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. I have an estate where I raise horses. He looks like a shoo-in for membership. One last question, sir. What is your religion? My religion? Why, I am a goy. Because most Jews didn't convert in order to become Christians. Throughout history, they converted in order to become goyim, to become part of the majority. In 1818, a rule is passed in Prussia that Jews are no longer allowed to practice law. So a man named Heinrich Marx converts his 6 children, including his son Karl Marx, who grows up to be a vicious anti-Semite. Around the same time in England, Isaac Disraeli converts his son Benjamin, and by that act of conversion ultimately enables his son to one day become prime minister. He doesn't try in any way to disguise his origins. Look at the last name that he kept. So in any way, assimilation has been a tool by which many Jews have been able to leave the Jewish community. And unless one believes we're in danger of a Nazi type of anti-Semitism that's going to check back generations, and it was fairly distinctive to the Nazis to do that, assimilation is a way out. The problem is it's not a cure for anti-Semitism. A cure for a disease means that the patient can go on living. A cure for anti-Semitism means that Jews can go on affirming their Jewishness without suffering because of it. Another thing Jews can do is to try and increase their numbers, to seek converts. And I think there are reasons for Jews to being very open to doing that. I recently completed, as Richard mentioned, a book on the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And one issue which I saw the Rebbe did not really address very much was the issue of seeking converts. That he did. He didn't think Jews should do so. But I wanted to know if he addressed it in one specific context, and that is the children of Jewish fathers and non-Jewish mothers, which I think the Jewish community should go out of its way to find a way to seek these people, to embrace them and bring them into the community. I kept asking this, by the way, with Chabad Shluchim, because I said, it used to be that if somebody had a Jewish last name, we presumed that they were Jewish. Now, of course, a Jewish last name is no presumption of Jewishness, because there are so many Jewish men who are married to non-Jewish women. And I think it's imperative that we not lose them. We're a declining group. In 1938, just prior to the Holocaust, there were about 2 billion people in the world, and Jews were estimated to have a population of 18 million. We've never recovered from the Holocaust. There are today estimated to be about 13 million Jews in the world of about 7 billion people. So whereas at one time we were about 3/4 of 1% of the world's population, now we're about 1/5 of 1% of the world's population. In other words, at one point we were about 7 or 8 out of every 1,000 people in the world. Now we're about 2. Non-Jews have trouble believing that. Studies show that non-Jews have a tendency to think Jews are like 15% of the population of the United States. A friend of mine was once on an airplane with a non-Jewish woman, and he asked her to guess how many Jews there were in the United States. She seemed informed about Jews. And she said, well, I know America's Protestant, Catholic, Jewish, and the Jews are the smallest group. There must be 30 million Jews in the United States. She said, no. He said, there are about 5 million. He said, well, then they all live in my city. But because we're overrepresented. But no matter what, even if we convert, and even if we convert the children who have Jewish fathers and others, we're never going to make the numbers of Jews so substantial that will answer the problem of anti-Semitism. What about Zionism? Zionism actually was a movement established to end anti-Semitism. That was what motivated Herzl. He thought only if the Jews had their own land would they be able to get the respect of other people, would they be safe from persecutions. And along the way, Zionism has achieved many remarkable things. Number one, most obviously, it created a Jewish state. 2, another miracle, it revived Hebrew as a spoken language. I don't know if there are other instances of a language that had stopped being spoken that ever got revived again. And 3, it has consistently served as a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution. The one thing Zionism did not achieve was the one thing it set out to achieve, which was to solve anti-Semitism. It used to be that when Jews would live in a city, anti-Semitism would focus on the ghetto where the Jews lived. Now it's like the world is one gigantic city, and Israel's the ghetto, and that's where anti-Semitism is focused. The only answer, ultimately, obviously, is a form of tikkun olam, changing the values of the world. But since it's not so easy to do that, so we have criteria for assessing the current levels of anti-Semitism. If you apply my thesis as anti-Semitism as a response to 3 pillars of Judaism, you start to see what sort of societies Jews are safe in and what sort of societies they're not. The greater the disparity between the society's reaction to Judaism's 3 pillars, the greater is going to be the amount of anti-Semitism in the society. Nazi Germany hated the notion of God because there was no authority higher than Hitler and the Nazi Party. Law. There was no law to which to appeal because the law was whatever Hitler and the Nazi Party said the law was. And as regards peoplehood, they believed in Aryan superiority and in Semitic and in Jewish inferiority. Take the Soviet Union. Same antagonism in all communist societies. Same antagonism to a belief in God. Similarly, there isn't a universal moral law to which you can appeal, whereas Judaism tried to establish that legal tradition. And of course, again, the peoplehood aspect. Look at the United States. It's at comfort with all 3 aspects of Judaism. America has always been God-oriented. All American presidents speak of God in their inaugural address. They don't speak of Jesus. So America has been God-oriented, but not denominationally oriented. Jews, therefore, have a vested interest in keeping that balance. Now, most Jews are conscious of that balance. They certainly don't want to have an evangelically Christian president speaking about evangelical beliefs. They're balanced in that regard. Many Jews, though, are attracted to very secular ideologies, and not realizing that it actually is within the Jewish interest to live in a society that sees the major contribution the Jews brought to the world as having some value, which is the notion of monotheism. So America has been very moderate in that regard on religion. For all that we think of America as a religious Christian society, America, as significant as Christianity is a law-based society. It's not surprising that Jews have done very well, given that Judaism as a religious system is also very much a law-based system. And finally, also, in terms of peoplehood, America has been a nation of immigrants. People who did not like that aspect of America usually don't end up liking Jews. What was the name of Charles Lindbergh's anti-Semitic movement in the 1930s? It was called America First. I mean, technically, it was not an anti-Semitic movement. Technically, it was committed to keeping America out of World War II. But once Lindbergh delivered his famous speech that it's the Jews who are trying to drag America into World War II, the movement became identified with it. Does anybody know 20 years ago who tried to revive a political party in the United States and call it America First?
Buchanan?
Pat Buchanan. I remember at that time, there are very few new jokes I hear, because I've studied Jewish humor a long time. One of the few new ones I ever heard was Buchanan, Farrakhan, and a rabbi get marooned on an island. And Farrakhan prays to God and says, God, please just get me off this island and take me and all the black Americans back to Africa. The rabbi says, God, please get me off this island and take me and all the Jews back to Israel. Buchanan says, God, in that case, all I want is a Diet Coke. And so Buchanan, tried at that time to do it. And of course, Jews tend to see America First people as being hostile to Jewish interests. How can Jews tell when they're in danger in a society? And the danger, there's a very easy test to tell. When someone is exposed as an anti-Semite, is it detrimental to the person or is it positive? Obviously, exposing somebody as an anti-Semite in Iran makes the person far more popular. What happens when somebody takes anti-Semitic positions in the United States? Well, you remember in the 80s, Jesse Jackson did so, and he felt compelled to apologize. Do I think in his heart Jackson has animosities towards Jews? Yes. But the fact that he felt compelled to apologize, that's a good sign. At the same time, when Pat Buchanan was exposed as an anti-Semite, he refused to back down. And what happened? He was marginalized right out of the Republican Party. That's why he had to establish an American Independent Party. But he then wrote a book called America First. So that's really the criteria that we know. When somebody would be exposed as an anti-Semite and would feel no reason to apologize, and in fact would gain in popularity as a result, that's how we would know that we Jews were in danger. So I think that trying to understand anti-Semitism through the focus of its response to Jewish values and to Judaism gives us really another mechanism by which we can understand the phenomenon, and another mechanism by how we can judge the phenomenon and see whether Jews are in a peaceful situation. Just having said that, it can't be the whole focus of Jewish life. Ultimately, the focus of Jewish life is not to frustrate anti-Semites, but it's really to try and affirm all those values that I spoke about of God, law, and peoplehood, and expand them. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you very much. It was a brilliant presentation. So I have a question that I'd like you to try to answer from a Jewish world perspective. So the three pillars of Judaism that you spoke of, and in Judaism we believe that God is responsible for everything, He created everything. So from a Jewish perspective, why is there anti-Semitism? That in the sense that in Tehillim it says that God examines the righteous and chastises us for our sins. So some will argue, and some communities, the Jewish communities, some will blame ourselves for that our failures is creating anti-Semitism by not keeping Shabbat, by not living up to all sorts of things. That our sins is the reason why anti-Semitism exists. So from a Jewish perspective, not from a sociological perspective or Western social science, so why does anti-Semitism exist? If God exists and He gave us the three pillars, why have we suffered so historically?
Okay, so number one, obviously, I don't accept the belief that because of Jewish ritual sins, God imposes the Holocaust. There actually was a Jewish thinker of some distinction in Israel named Rabbi Elazar Shach, who did hold that position, which, needless to say, was accepted by many people in the Haredi world, rejected by many there, and caused an enormous amount of antagonism. He said God counts up our sins, and when they reached 6 million, that's when he imposed the Holocaust. Interestingly, in my book on the Rebbe, I have the Rebbe's response to that, in which he said it's forbidden to say that God is there like a cool person counting up sins. Now, it's interesting, though, that people would focus it on ritual sins and God inflicting punishment. One could argue something else, which is interesting, that if Jews don't try and influence the world with its notions of ethical monotheism, Jews will suffer in a world that doesn't accept those notions. In other words, Jews didn't suffer from the Nazis because the Nazis were punishing Jews at God's behest, but they suffered in the fact that they were living in a society that accepted very alien values, that accepted values that were very hateful of God. So we have a personal self-interest, not in converting people to Judaism, but in influencing people to believe that there's one God whose primary demands of human beings are moral. The attempt to use God to account for anti-Semitism, it's actually I would actually argue it's foolish, and I'll tell you why. It's been used by every side of the group. Zionists used it. You know, the Zionist case was actually a logical case. The Jews who stayed in Europe were killed in the Holocaust. The Jews who were Zionists and who left weren't. It's disgusting. If anybody tried to use that to explain anything, I'd be furious at them. But I'm just simply showing, on its face, you can't say that. Jews become irreligious and they suffer. There's no correlation. Among the Jews who suffered, certainly in Poland, the percentage who were religiously observant was much higher than Jews in the United States who didn't suffer in that way. But you could argue it, instead of always defining Judaism as primarily through its ritual component, that Jews have a vested interest in making known and influencing people to that world. I'll give you an example in the United States. America, as far as I know, is the only society in history that has a self-definition commonly used of Judeo-Christian ethic. Now, there are no shortage of Jews who say, well, you can't really say it's the same thing, Judaism and Christianity. I wouldn't advise most Jews at a political point to go around trying to prove to Christians that you're not a Judeo-Christian. No, but it's in itself, it's a fascinating thing. I remember when I lived in Israel in the 80s, Israelis would sometimes say to me, you American Jews are naive. You think you're the first Jews who ever had equal rights, and look what happened in France, look what happened in Germany. And one day the answer occurred to me. The United States is not the first society in which Jews have been emancipated. It is, however, the first society in which Judaism has been emancipated. When Jews were emancipated in Europe, Judaism still had no status. It was an expression among European Jews. Be a Jew at home and a human being in the streets, a mensch in the streets, which is a pathetic statement. They couldn't do it. France, you had the phenomenon of Jewish men who would wear wigs to make them look like yarmulkes because they didn't want to be perceived as wearing a kippah. They were uncomfortable doing so. What do I mean when I say Judaism has status in the United States in the way it did in Europe? How many people in this room, by a show of hands, know 2 or more non-Jews who've converted to Judaism? Everybody. How many of you know 2 or more Jews who become Christians? Okay, 2 people out of this group. Had we been meeting 100 years ago in France or in Germany, it would have been the exact opposite. If I would have said to you at that time when Jews were emancipated, how many of you know 2 or more non-Jews who converted to Judaism? You would have looked at me as if I was Meshuggah. Nobody was converted to Judaism. How many of you know 2 or more Jews who've become Christians? Everybody knew many Jews who had become. It had become a common phenomenon of Jews leaving. So Jews have status in a way they didn't have in Europe. I mean, ironically, Joe Lieberman was nominated as the vice presidential candidate, one of the reasons being the fact that he was a religious Jew was conceived as being a positive thing. What happened was, if you remember, Gore was running. There had recently been this very unfortunate scandal with President Clinton, and basically it seemed like the Christian right had gotten the Republican Party. So Lieberman's religiosity was considered a status. Who would have ever thought such a thing? I remember in 1964, I was in high school when Barry Goldwater was nominated to be the Republican candidate for president. Meeting Harry Golden make the famous observation, I always knew that the first Jew nominated for president would be an Episcopalian. But, had somebody told us in '64 that in 2000 there would be a Jewish candidate on the national ticket, we would have assumed it's what we used to call a 2 or 3 day a year Jew. Somebody who might go to synagogue on Rosh Hashanah, on Yom Kippur, and go to a Passover Seder. Had somebody said, no, he's going to be a religious guy who's not going to campaign on Saturday, it would have seemed ridiculous. In the 1930s, the New York Times, the Jewish-owned New York Times, was still publishing classified ads. Hebrews, no matter how qualified, need not apply. When Jews got so angry at Sulzberger for publishing those ads, he said, I'm only doing it to spare Jews embarrassment. He said, I don't want Jews showing up at offices and then thinking they had a shot at a job and that they had no shot at it. So there's been, this has been the case, this has been the status. And just to briefly go back to your thing, obviously people who feel that God's going to punish the Jews because of Sabbath violations by sending the Nazis as his messengers, the fear I have is, are any of you familiar with the writings of C.S. Lewis? Lewis wrote a book, A Grief Observed. Lewis, late in his life, had been a lifelong bachelor. He fell in love with a woman. There's a beautiful movie about it called Shadowlands with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. Yeah, I mean, the only thing about the movie that's a little sad to me is the woman he falls in love with, who becomes an incredibly devout and devoted Christian, was an alienated Jewish woman from a left-wing background. So I mean, that's sad to me because we've lost some very good people. But anyway, she then dies. And he struggles with that belief. Does everything that happened in this world is God's will and things like that? And he then ultimately rejects it because he says, but that turns God into a monster. I would hate such a God. And it's hard to raise your children to feel, we all want our children to love God. We want them to fear God. We want them to have fear of the consequences of doing evil. But we certainly don't want them to fear that if they become non-observant, and many Jews become non-observant, God's going to unleash a Hitler against it. And so that's why ultimately, when Schacht did that, the Rebbe responded to him, and actually without naming him, because it was characteristic of the Rebbe, he would not name people he opposed. He would never mention their names in speeches. I was speaking to Michal Seligson, who spent 20 years compiling a 1,600-page index of the Rebbe's speeches, and he said he could not remember instances in which the Rebbe criticized someone by name. I found out that it's not entirely true. He had some, but he didn't mention Schacht by name, but he actually said it's a Chilul Hashem. It desecrates God's name to associate him with having permitted or encouraged such a thing and wanting it. So anyway, we don't want to do the work of anti-Semites. Anti-Semites already say that everything we do to the Jews they deserve. So if Jews then say, yeah, and God thinks so too, look what we're going to end up doing.
So it's down to free will?
I would say that, yeah, I would say the glory of human beings is that they have free will and that they can use that free will to do evil. Do I still pray when people are sick? I am praying desperately. I am learning. I went back, which I hadn't done for years, to a steady study now of Talmud, and what motivated me to do it is because a very, very dear friend of mine is very, very, very sick. So yes, do I believe we can influence God by our behavior? Yes, I do. But the moment people start being certain that they can determine what God's going to do, they tend to become very dangerous. When people do what they think God would do in the circumstances, I don't know if God wants them to be their representative.
They give voices.
Yeah, they give voices. Yeah. Yes.
Thank you. It was a wonderful thesis. I'm wondering, it seems to me that the three pillars actually are very interdependent. So, for example, you couldn't actually have law or have this faith without having some peoplehood. You can't do those things alone.
Right.
So you actually have to have peoplehood. And yet what we've come in for, and I know it's been extremely hypocritical because it's been done in the name of other nationalisms, but the contemporary anti-Semites, those who are anti-Israel, very much accuse us of being nationalists, right, and nationalistically exclusive. I mean, that's one of the major left-wing anti-Zionist tropes. And I'm wondering how
in the sense of Israel being a Jewish state?
in the sense of Israel being a Jewish state, in the sense of I think, it goes back to older anti-Semitic tropes about, Jews being exclusionary and being, an elitist clique of their own. So I'm wondering
Okay, but
how
how do you handle that evangelical Christianity's assertion that if you don't believe in Jesus, you go to hell? I mean, that's a form of chosenness, that no matter how good a person you are, you will go to hell. Now again, I say this, and I think evangelical Christianity has reached out to Jews in a remarkable way, but I'm simply saying, I think the word for China in Chinese means center of the earth, of the world. It's only Jews that somehow get blamed with it. I'm not exactly clear why. I think it has some tie into the notion of chosenness, but I think the problem is other people try to appropriate the chosenness for themselves. Christianity spoke of the new Israel. Islam felt that it had come to supplant Judaism, and yet the Jews continue. So I think it bothers people. Some non-Jews are impressed by it. William Buckley was an example of it. When he made that comment to me, he said, I only hope if the Jews do get the Jews out of Russia, you go on protesting, so at least you'll protest, because he was struck by the affinities that Jews had. I think Jews were often shocked. The Maronites, Christians in Lebanon, treated terribly. And the Christian world, by and large, doesn't seem consumed, it doesn't seem concerned in a way that we would imagine when we hear bad things are happening to Jews in other countries. That's why I said it's sort of the glory of Judaism, and yet I think for many leftists, many of whom, needless to say, are Jews or of Jewish extraction, I think they use a certain strategy which I find very cynical. They're like Abraham was willing to sacrifice Isaac. But the whole reason the story of Abraham and Isaac moves us is because we know Abraham loved God, and we know that Abraham also loved Isaac. And ultimately, the punchline to the story is God doesn't want human sacrifice. I think many of these leftists are willing to sell Israel down the river, and say, acting like they care. But the truth is they don't. They're self-hating Jews. Chomsky, I don't think cares very much. So what leftists say, because they're so selective in who they choose to criticize, the left, they don't criticize hypocrisies on the left, and they pick on the Jews. So I sort of made a decision early in life that there are two groups, no matter how broad an appeal I try and make on behalf of Judaism, I'm never going to reach, which is Jews on the far left and Jews on the far right. And I mean religiously in those circles, but there's a very large center of people. So those Jews, those sorts of people on the left who take the positions you're talking about, there is no argument that will change their mind. And therefore, and it's important to know that. Because once you realize that there's no argument that's going to change another person's mind, you'll stop devoting time or energy to doing it, and you'll just recognize that the person is an enemy, and however you can defeat them, it's important to defeat them. Yes?
I believe you said Reformed Jews dropped the notion of a Jewish peoplehood to a
In the 19th century, yes.
In the 19th century. For me, that's a very significant and important statement because, well, how is that? How do you see that reflected in what Reformed Jews say and do, and the Reformed institution, like the head of the Reformed rabbi, the head of the Reformed rabbi? The rabbinic.
No, wait. I want to be very careful in what I'm saying and what I'm not saying. 19th century Reformed Judaism felt that for Jews to be fully emancipated, they had to be able to state. And they believed that they had to be able to state, we Jews are only a religion, we're not a people. In 1840, I'll take it in a minute, in 1840 a very shocking event happens. The blood libel is introduced into Damascus, into the Arab world. And it becomes the first time that Jews throughout the world try and stop an anti-Semitic act like that. So you had Adolphe Camus in France, and French was supporting it. You had Montefiore in England. Jews go to Martin Van Buren. The only thing I know about Martin Van Buren and the Jews is that he opened up his desk and showed that he had already written a letter criticizing it. They go to Abraham Geiger in Germany, the head of the Reform community in Germany. He said, don't try and turn this into a Jewish issue. He said, I feel personally sympathetic to these people, but I'm more concerned with my fellow Jews here in Germany, that they can get it. So that was characteristic. Now what happened was, and it changed. There were historical events that indicated the change. In 1937, in Columbia, at the Columbia Convention of the Reform Rabbinate, they changed to an affirmative position on Zionism. So it changed. I mean, you're probably aware that in the history of reform, even in the United States, there was an organization called the American Council for Judaism, which vigorously opposed Zionism. But it did change. So I would not. It's not a fair claim to make, but it sounded like you thought it was still true.
I believe it's absolutely true, and everything I see coming from the head rabbi of Reform Judaism. You look at
Rick Jacobs?
previous one.
Not Eric Galpi, I don't know how you could say that, Eric Galpi.
I see it reflected everywhere in Reform Judaism. The state of Israel, they're not that keen on it.
Okay.
Just a bolster that. I think it's a strong. There is a strong leftist critique of Israel coming from both the left wing of the conservative movement, like BJ here on the Upper West Side. Maybe that's.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Does everybody want to comment on this, Richard?
This is I think there's a theme running through the questions and through your statement that I want to pinpoint, and that is that as some kind of collective Jewish response to anti-Semitism, be it aggressive, threatening anti-Semitism, or simply a form of anti-Semitism that creates a ceiling, a social ceiling, or a financial ceiling, an exclusivity of some kind, there's throughout modern times, and maybe before, a kind of delusion on the part of Jews that they influence anti-Semitism by acting less like less like a people, by acting less Jewish. I remember my father asking me when I went to Harvard in 1960, how did my Christian roommates, aristocratic Christian roommates, react to my putting on tefillin? And I remember saying to him, "Pa, you don't understand. They either like Jews or they don't like Jews. Mostly they do. It's not going to be influenced by whether only Jews care and judge me by whether I put on tefillin, and only Jews might find it unattractive." And I think that theme was behind the reform movement growing out of an assimilating move in Western Europe, was to some extent a movement not to look too Jewish, not to be allied with Eastern European Jews. The split that you talk about between German and Eastern European Jews, which dominated the atmosphere I grew up in, was the delusion that non-Jews based their opinion of you on whether you looked a certain Jewish way or another Jewish way. It's an illusion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's excellent. That's a very important point, and you're right. I remember that was part of it ties in, though, again, I don't want to be unfair to the reform movement, but it ties in. There was an exchange of letters between the Rebbe when Chabad started the campaign of having public Hanukkah lightings of candles. How many of you remember, were any of you here uncomfortable with that when they started doing it on like government property and other things? Okay, so some are. Okay, so Joe Glazer, who was the head of the Reform Rabbinical Organization, wrote a series of letters to the Rebbe. One of the points the Rebbe made, to Glazer and to others as well, he said, "I still can't believe that in the aftermath of what happened to the Jews starting in Germany, there are still Jews who think," along to the point Richard was making, there are still Jews who think that if we're going to act less publicly Jewish, we'll be more accepted. You have to, if you want to oppose it on different grounds, but that's not the grounds. And there was the one, in all of Philip Roth's writings, probably the most sympathetic story he ever wrote about the Jews was a story called Eli the Fanatic, where this young Jew in a town, it was a town in Westchester, starts becoming religiously observant. And the Jews are very upset because the yeshiva has moved into the town. And the head of the yeshiva says to them at one point, "You think we're going to cause the anti-Semitism? You're the ones who caused it. You're the ones they don't want to have coming into their country clubs. They don't care about us." And so it's an interesting misapprehension. Okay, let me just take all the people who still had their hands up. Okay, wow, okay, yes. I will try and be briefer. Okay.
Just a quick note on Reform Judaism and Zionism today. Historically, it was we want to be citizens of the Hebrew religion, of the CCAR conference in the 19th century. And it came to the point where by the 60s, 70s, the rabbinical school was required a year in Israel. They established a rabbinical school in Israel to this day that requires at least 1 year's study in Israel. They've done many things that were pro-Israel to the point where now there is a head of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations who is on the J Street board. And it's not just Reform Judaism, but even in the conservative Jewish Theological Seminary, just up the blocks here, you have rabbis who are concerned with how corrupted Israel is by occupation, having accepted the narrative of the Nakba. I wanted to address Jewish identification, and there are people like Avram Infeld who speak about a number of characteristics that make a person a Jew, and religion is just one of them. And if you look at the world and look at the Jewish population, you can see that many Jews are totally non-religious but Jewishly identified and part of the Jewish people. And he suggests that religion is one, but not the most important or even the most necessary, and can be entirely gone.
By the way, I don't know if that's distinctive to Abraham. It strikes me that was at the heart of Mordechai Kaplan's defining Judaism as a civilization. His famous book was Judaism as a Civilization.
Okay.
And by the way, Infeld, who I know well, who was himself actually quite a religious Jew.
Yes.
Listen, obviously I believe in religion on its own. I don't believe in religion as just having utilitarian value. It's justified because I think of its truth. But nonetheless, it's not. Who are we fooling? We're not going to go on as a culture indefinitely. We won't, except for those people who really believe at the heart of Judaism that there is a truth in doing these things. It's going to come to an end.
What is going to happen?
The Jewish people. If Jews all collectively stop believing in God, and certainly stop believing, therefore, in the binding nature of Jewish law, it's hard to maintain a culture forever that the culture largely emanated out of the belief in those very things. It's nice to go to Fiddler on the Roof, but remember, ultimately, Tevye was a religious character. And the whole power of his story was because of his struggles with God, what he feels, his issues with God, but there's still a God that he's struggling with. And if that all becomes eliminated, what's the case to be made for the perpetuation of Judaism any more than any other, cultural thing? Yes, it's nice that you go to Ireland and they have a tavern where they sing Irish ballads, but it has to be a little more serious than that.
Unless they live in Israel.
Unless they live in Israel. You're right. But even in Israel, it ultimately needs something more significant than that. Remember in Israel they had at one time a movement of Israeli Hebrew poets called Canaanites because they didn't want to feel any attachment to the diaspora. Yes?
I had a bit more of a politically focused question, just coming from my own personal experience. I'm curious, why are so many Jewish students at universities and Jewish professors, like Judith Butler, say, so vehemently anti-Zionist, and is this a new thing?
Unfortunately, it's not a new thing. It's the legacy of the odd feature of the attraction. It's a new variation, I think, in a sense, of the attraction historically of Jews to leftist and to communist ideologies. It's a hard thing to explain. I think it's one of the ways in which the left showed its loyalty, so to speak, to a higher value. The subject of Jews and communism is a sensitive subject for Jews because now that the world recognizes what a horror communism contributed to the world, recognizes Stalin was up there with Hitler in terms of evil, and yet we encounter the peculiar phenomenon that whereas we expect everybody in the world to hate Hitler, there were no shortage of Jews in the 1930s and 40s who admired Stalin. I know that from my parents because they knew the circles in which they turned. My father had gotten out of Russia when he was 16 and went to City College in the 1930s. He knew what it was like because my father had lived until the age of 16 under communist rule, and he couldn't believe people who romanticized and glorified communism, and by and large who were very contemptuous of Judaism. Remember, one of the aspects of communism was atheism. So again, my criteria of the three things is this. A Jew who does not subscribe to any of the three pillars of Judaism is, in my view, what could be called a non-Jewish Jew. And Jews suffer from non-Jewish Jews because the world sees them as Jews and sees their actions as despicable and hates them and blames it on the Jews. And we suffer as Jews because they are hateful to the Jews. And the classic example I'm speaking of is Karl Marx. Karl Marx is thought of by many anti-communists as having been a Jew. Karl Marx was so hateful of Judaism that Hitler actually acknowledged that one of Marx's ideas had influenced him. And he writes, he says, I am unhappy to admit that it comes from none other than one of them. You know, Marx's claim that Jews, the only thing Jews really worshipped was money, was not God. So here, you know, we suffer from it. It's a double-edged sword, which is what happens with Jews on the left, who I think it's their way of proving, among other things, that they do it. When I get to Jews who are not quite as extreme, I'll just tell you a funny observation I once heard from Uri Simon. Uri Simon is a dove in Israel, by Israeli political standards, and he's a religious Jew. His father, Ernst Simon, was a friend of Martin Buber's, who became an observant Jew, and Ernst Simon became famous for a statement he once made: "My problem in life is that the people I can talk to, I can't pray with, and the people I can pray with, I can't talk to." A statement that David Weiss Halivni later on used to quote. But Uri once said something very interesting to me. He said, "The irony I find in Israel is the following." And remember, it's a double statement, so one half is bound to annoy some of you in this room, and the other half you'll find funny. But it depends on what your political orientation as to which half it is. He said, "The irony in life in Israel is this. It's the people in Israel who most believe that we're the chosen people, who are most apt to justify any stance Israel takes on any issue on the grounds that we have the right to be like any other nation. And it's the people in Israel who least believe that we're the chosen people, who are most apt to hold Israel to a standard they won't hold any other nation." And it defines, I think, an interesting paradox about it. But the self-hating Jews, that's really what they are. They're Isaac Deutscher, who was himself such a person, defined what he called a non-Jewish Jew. It wasn't only Marx. Trotsky was the same. Trotsky's born name was Lev Bronstein. He was the head of the Red Army. When the Jews came and pleaded with him to use the Red Army to stop the pogroms, which were being led by people blaming communism on the Jews, he said, "Why do you come to me? He said, "Why do you come to me? I'm a socialist. I'm not a Jew." Now, Rabbi Meza, who was the rabbi in Moscow who met with Trotsky, claims that they said that he then said to Trotsky, but I'm sure he didn't. He didn't want to get killed. But he later on said of that encounter, he said, "That's the tragedy in life." He says, "It's the Trotskys who lead the revolutions, and it's the Bronsteins who pay the price." And that's, in a sense, that's what he meant by that phenomenon that was going on. Yes?
If you're a scholar of Jew hatred that's really like at least 3,000 years,
Right.
are you uncomfortable, as I am, with using the term anti-Semitism that was invented by a 19th century anti-Semite?
And Wilhelm Marr. Yes, I am
I
uncomfortable.
don't like that term.
Okay, I am uncomfortable, and as a result, what I do is the following. When Marr created the term anti-Semitism, he created it because he thought Budenhaus, Jew hater, sounded too vulgar. So he wanted to make it sound scientific. So in all of my books, in every book I've written, I've always had a problem with the editors, and then they agree to it, is I never write anti-Semite the way it's conventionally written. I write it as ANTISEMITE, not anti-S. Because it was only as a code word for Jews, and it gave Arab anti-Semites love to say that. We're Semites. So that's why, because it's become the accepted word, that's why I'm willing to use it, but that's why Emil Fackenheim is the one who influenced me to make that change, and I think he was right. And the last question, I think. Okay, next question. Yes.
Yes, I wanted to react to your statement that the drive to abandon nationhood is one of the three pillars of the Jewish entity.
Not the drive to obey. Oh, it's one of the pillars of
the Jewish entity, of the Jewish identification. And you said that it was very predominant in the 19th century, and it was what drove the early reform movement.
right.
I'm afraid that this is what's happening nowadays, in maybe in larger numbers. If you look at the phenomenon of American Jewry, it's not just lack of identification, but abandonment of identification with what is the epicenter of Jewish life, which is Israel. I believe is just as much of a demonstration, manifestation of the same phenomenon, is it not?
Yes.
You have so many students, you have so many kids who've been in every corner of the world, but they will never go to Israel. They feel ashamed to be associated with an organization that has, not in religious terms, but an organization that, forget about religion, that is describing itself as promoting Judaism as a nationhood, or the interest of the nation, the interest of its state. I think the phenomenon is much more predominant now than it was in the 19th century.
Really?
Or at least it's predominant, no?
Well, listen, I suppose, Dickens' line, it's the best of times and the worst of times always applies. I mean, there are certainly the manifestations of Jewish life on campuses today are much stronger than they've ever been in the past. So I'm loath to say that, that it's that much, that things have deteriorated so much. I don't know. I mean, I want to take into account what you're saying. It's a frightening thing that you're saying, that if the peoplehood aspect, because that's the one thing we always took for granted, that even if a Jew became non-observant, he still cared. He still cared about other Jews. If the legacy of generations of Jews being alienated from Judaism becomes being alienated from a sense of Jewish peoplehood, then you're right. Then the danger is very, very
The answer lies in the fact that while you described it as so beautifully at three different pillars for the Jewish identity, that none of the pillars can stand on its own.
That is definitely correct. But what was always distinctive to Jews, I'll tell you why I had this insight many years ago. Dennis and I, when we were in LA, maybe I'll you still have a question. Okay, then I'll do that. Okay. Dennis and I, when we were in LA, used to do interviews with people of different backgrounds, a forum on contemporary values. And we were once struck by something. We had done an interview with a man named Jorge Mejia, who subsequently became a bishop. At the time, Jorge was Pope John Paul II's liaison between the Catholic Church and the Jewish community. And at a certain point in the interview, we asked him about issues of faith. Does he have doubts about God, about Jesus? And he said, my entire life, I have never once doubted God's existence or that Jesus is God. A year later, we did an interview like that with Jerry Falwell. And by the way, I came out of that interview, I just want to say in one sentence, because Falwell is so well known, I came out of that interview with two thoughts. I never want Falwell to get any political power in America, and the man is not an anti-Semite. Because when Jews don't like somebody politically, they have an ugly tendency to claim the person was an anti-Semite. And I don't think he wasn't. But anyway, we asked Falwell that same question. It turned out Falwell, as a young man, had grown up in a non-religious household, and then he told us, but once he had a conversionary experience in 1950 with some radio evangelist, he said, since then I've never had one moment of doubt. And I remember Dennis and I driving home, we're talking about the fact we both come out of Orthodox families, and I've never met anybody who said they never had any doubt. And it occurred to me that there was a brilliance in the three pillars of Judaism. Even if you're temporarily feeling alienated from one of them, you can still fully connect as a Jew. A profound Orthodox rabbi that I know, who's a great legal scholar as well, once told me, and I'm obviously not mentioning his name because it's not something you talk about, he said he went through periods of doubt about God, but he always stayed very observant, and it came through with him. For Christians, you don't have exactly that pillar. And if you're really having doubts about Christianity, about Christ, it's hard to think of yourself as a Christian. Much as if the name of Judaism religion, let's say, was called God. So if you're having doubts about God, it's hard to be in that religion if you really don't think Christ is the God. So I thought the brilliance of the three is you could have one. Now, obviously, ideally, you want to be active in all. You want Jews to be active in all three components, but you can also recognize that if somebody is very passionately committed to one, it doesn't matter. You see it. Martin Gilbert, the British Jewish historian, I happen to have been friendly with. Not a religious Jew in any conventional sense of the word, but obviously passionately committed to Jewish peoplehood. David Ben-Gurion, or others. But you're right. So we need all three there, but we can also countenance some people being more involved in one than in the other. But once somebody becomes alienated from all three, which is how I would define a Noam Chomsky, then I think you're outside the parameters. Okay, this is the last because I know we're yes.
I have worked at a Jewish school in Iran way back under the Shah, and it strikes me that in Islam or Shia Islam, if you're a people of the book, you're a dhimmi, you're persecuted. Inferior minorities are protected in your own way.
Right.
So perhaps part of what you see in the anti-Zionism now is Jews as a sovereign nation, Jews as a majority ruling over Muslims disturbs the order of things, and that even historically, perhaps the Jews were a persecuted minority in the ghetto, that's one thing. But if they think they're superior, because they're educated, or they have more money, or they have power, that disturbs the notion that they should be inferior or persecuted or minority.
Yeah, no, I think there's a great deal to what you're saying, and I think the proof of the support for what you're saying was that the other society that inspired such an antagonistic feeling on the part of Islam was Lebanon, where Christians for a long point, had some power there, and basically the effort is to dislodge them. So I think you're right. I think that's what Islam has to come to grips with. On this happy note.
So Rabbi Christian, thank you very much on behalf of ISGAP, and thank you, Professor Stone, for this.